Everybody, it's Coach Ace coming to you live from my workout room in the house. So we have a little bit of an issue. A lot of us haven't been able to get in some of the chapters, and I gave you the weekend to get those chapters in. And I thought, all right, well, let me help some folks out and kind of pull away any excuses. So I'm going to do some short videos on chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, and maybe even 12 if I feel great, right? Anyway, do some chapter videos and just get you caught up on some of the things that we didn't necessarily go over in class, so that when you read the chapter or you have questions on it, you'll be able to connect the dots a little better, all right? And so I'm going to just go over chapter 8 to begin with. And chapter 8, remember, it starts with the United States and economic crisis. And the big question is, like, why is the United States in economic crisis? Well, the United States in economic crisis because the British have a blockade. Now, the British are our primary trading partners, and when someone blockades you, that means they're not allowing your ships to go back and forth. So you're not being able to trade at the same level. If you can't trade and sell your goods, that means you can't have money come into the system. Even worse than that is that you're going to be in a position where you also can't have goods come into the system, right? Another reason why there's economic crisis is that the Army officers and guys in the Army, first off, are still trying to get money for supplies and things of that nature because they're pretty active still. But even though the war's over, they still have to be active. They still have to be commissioned because you never know what can happen. And deeper than that, sooner or later, their pensions are going to come up. These Army guys need to be paid for their service. And so there's money going into those areas, and people are not receiving the goods that they used to receive because of the British blockade. And so you have major problems there, right? Cool. Now that we talked about that, let's really talk about the Constitutional Convention, all right? So at this point, look, the Articles of Confederation don't work. We've talked about this, man. First off, you have all these weaknesses. The primary weakness is that there's no executive, so no one can make anyone do anything, right? Number one. Number two, besides the fact that there's no executive, there's a situation where all 13 states have to say yes before something is done. Come on, man. You can't even get 12 people to order pizza the right way. I know that from my rise. So clearly, if you have to do everything unanimously, it's not going to work. So the articles are weak in that regard. Now, the other states, the states are like, look, these articles aren't working. We're not able to really tax each. We can't tax the states. No one's listening to anybody, and there's no executive. So we have to write a constitution. So there's a constitutional convention that starts in 1787. All right, starts in May. All right, it's going to be 55 gentlemen. I know, ladies, U.S. history. It seems like there's no ladies around early on, right? Anyway, 55 gentlemen from 12 states. You know who didn't come through? Rhode Island. Rhode Island don't come in nothing. Rhode Island's against it. Don't come in nothing, right? Anyway, so 55 folks, 12 states, and they're like, we're going to have to redraft these Articles of Confederation. So when they first start out, they don't really want to make a new thing. They want to just play with the articles. And then they recognize as they go through the process that, no, we have to make a new thing. Well, you have two camps or two different groups when we redo the Constitution. It's going to be the Federalists and it's going to be the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists want a big federal government where the government in the capital, right? Let's say in this case now we know the capital is D.C. The government in the capital is going to be the overall government. They're going to have more power. So it's going to be centralized. Power is going to be in one place. The Anti-Federalists are like, no, no, no. We came into this as 12, 13 independent little states and colonies, and we want to keep that level of independence. So Anti-Federalists want more power granted to the states. So they're the states' rights camp, okay? So states' rights, Anti-Federalists, federal, big, giant government, central government on the Federalist side. An example of a Federalist is my homeboy, Alexander Hamilton, right? An example, actually, of an Anti-Federalist in this case would be someone like Thomas Jefferson, and some other folks, all right? Now, this is what ends up happening. We have to talk about the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. Remember, the Virginia Plan, is the big state plan, and that says that everything's going to be based on population, and that's how you get into the Senate and House of Representatives. On the other side, you're going to have the New Jersey Plan, Patterson's plan. That's going to be there's going to be everything's going to be based on the fact that you exist. Small state plan, everybody get one man, one vote, right? Well, you know they're going to come together, have the Great Compromise, Connecticut plan, which is Sherman's plan, right? Simple. We've done that a million times. And then you also know that part of the Constitution being ratified is the Three-Fifths Amendment. Now, remember this one? It's where you take a situation where the South says, look, these slaves cost us money and we pay for them and they're expensive. You have to keep their upkeep. And so they should be, and they're people. So they should count into our population figures to get the people into the House of Representatives. They also argue that the slaves are like children, and even though they cost us money, they don't really gain us any major money, which is a lie, whatever, economic value, whatever it is. And they don't own property, so they shouldn't be taxed. So the South is saying, count the slaves when it comes to population, but don't count the slaves when it comes to taxes. The North is saying, Ixnay, if you want to keep your slaves, that's one thing. But you can't tell me that your slave it should count in the population because you own your slave and I own my cow. And I don't count my cows, right? So the North is like, no, no, no. Also, they're saying, well, you should also, then on the other side, they're like, well, they should count for tax purposes. And so it becomes this big battle. And there has to be some kind of compromise. The compromise is 3/5. Please understand that the 3/5 compromise is not about the value of a human being in a sense of like caring or not caring about black people. Don't let that be the issue. The issue is just financial. And it says this. You take all your slaves and you multiply that by 0.60, 3/5. And that is the number you're going to use in putting for taxes and for how many people come into the House of Representatives. That's what happens. And that's what the 3/5 Amendment is all about. And so on the chart that says the building of the new nation, that's the constitutional crisis, and that's how it's solved. All right? Now, we got those two plans out the way. Let's hit this other stuff up. There's still going to be all this fighting and arguing about how to ratify the Constitution. Now, the situation is this. The founding fathers, the men who fight the American Revolution, are now in a position where they fought the revolution, now they're free, and now they have to come under a government. Now, they just fought to get from underneath a king. Do you really think they want to have this super stretchy government? No, a lot of people do not want that at all. And so there we go again with that Federalist and Anti-Federalist fight. So to solve this problem, James Madison, little old James Madison from Virginia, writes this thing called the Bill of Rights. Now, we've had the quiz on the Bill of Rights and everything else, but academically on the APUSH exam, they might ask you a multiple choice question like, what was the key turning point in the Constitutional Convention? You're going to say James Madison writing the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights secures and gives all of these protections to the American people so that they don't feel that they're giving too much of their power and too much of their political selves to the government, so they don't feel like there's going to be more tyranny. Remember when we did Enlightenment, we talked about John Locke and everybody else, and the sense of like not having to give yourself too much to the government. Remember how Rousseau did not want that. Rousseau was like, no, you can't give everything up to the government, right? Well, the Bill of Rights kind of secures that. So, for example, if I right now said that, President Trump is a whore on national TV, I could not be arrested. You could turn the TV off. I could be fired from my TV job because that's private, but the government couldn't arrest me. Why? Because of Amendment 1, freedom of speech and freedom of press, right? Little stuff like that. And then let's talk about a few major things that you want to know from George Washington's presidency. Major thing number one is George Washington has this thing called the Judiciary Act, which makes the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court doesn't have a whole bunch of power yet. Remember, that happens during the Marshall regime. But you do want to be in a position where you know that Washington creates the Supreme Court in 1789, right? And then another thing that happens in the first presidency is Alexander Hamilton. Now, Alexander Hamilton was never president, but Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. So Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of Treasury, creates a situation called the Treasury number 1, where we take all of our money and put it in one place, right? It's almost like the nation's piggy bank. In addition to that, he puts us in a position where he wants to increase tariffs. Now, tariffs, we talked about this a million times. We'll talk about it again. Tariffs are when you tax goods from other countries coming into your country to protect your own industry. So he has high tariffs. He has the national bank, and he's going to create the thing called the first bank in the United States. So, yeah, I always call it the bus Bank of the United States. So it's the one bus. When we talk about Andrew Jackson, we're going to say two bus. All right. So we have the buses created by Hamilton. We have a tariff that's proposed, and it's just really about a situation to ask for us to get out of debt, so that when we get out of debt, we don't have to owe all this extra money, and we don't have the financial crashes. Right now, let's talk about the Intercourse Act. Don't be gross, right? So the Intercourse Act is how legally the United States says that they're going to deal with Native Americans, right? And so, obviously, the new United States wants to move west, and they want to move into the Ohio Valley. Remember, one of the reasons why the revolution happened is because of the proclamation of 1763 and how the colonists and the British were fighting about that kind of area, right? So, what you have is a situation, they wanted land, and they're, excuse me, sorry about that, guys. So pretty much it becomes a situation where the federal government becomes the only entity that can deal with Native American tribes, and that Native American tribes are going to be considered as separate countries, obviously, because they're not technically the United States, separate countries when we have treaties with them, right? And that's going to fall in, and that's going to be something we talk about when we talk about Andrew Jackson and how he really technically can't kick the Cherokee off the land because it's not American land and all those type of things, right? So that's the situation I have with that. Now, let's talk about two treaties that we didn't go over in class. It's called Jay's Treaty and Pinckney's Treaty, right? Jay's Treaty is set up by John Jay, and it's really about a situation to finally get the British off American land, right? And so to get the British off American land, we signed a treaty. Now, a lot of people were very angry about the treaty, especially Jeffersonians or people who in the Jefferson camp. Remember, Jefferson is a big Francophile. That means he likes the French. And Jay's Treaty actually gives some concessions away to the British. And so he's not an Anglophile. He doesn't like the British. And so Jefferson and his friends don't like the way that we are kind of like getting close again to the British versus being close to the French, who are actually our allies during the war. So that's the situation with that. Right? Now, let's talk about Washington's farewell address. Washington talks about the fact that he doesn't want us to get into political parties in his farewell address, which is crazy because now we're split up into two major political parties, and we kind of always have been two or three parties. And then he also says, let's stay out of foreign affairs. Let's just be clear. No one listened to Mr. Washington, right? And so that's what you want to get from the farewell address. Stay away from political parties and stay away from the affairs of Europe because it only gets us in trouble, which obviously we didn't. Now, speaking of that, as soon as Washington leaves, his vice president becomes President John Adams. John Adams, great lawyer, all those kind of fantastic things, but he has a really rocky presidency. And the first rocky thing that he has to deal with is the fact that there's the French and the British are fighting. He has to pick sides. He initially doesn't want to pick a side at all. And then guess what happens? The XYZ affair. Remember, we talked about this for a second. The XYZ affair, you have a situation where, sorry about that, the French ambassadors come in, right? And ambassadors are people who talk to each other politically and diplomatically, right? Fine and dandy. Well, back in the day in Europe, you used to have to pay bribes and stuff like that to speak to certain ambassadors or talk about certain topics. The Americans don't believe in that, supposedly, right? So they're not going to pay the bribe. Well, the French say, look, before we even talk, before you get to come to the table, you got to pay us money. And it just goes crazy. Everybody hears about it, and it becomes this big giant thing. It becomes an XYZ affair because they don't want to name the French agents, right? So now Adams looks weak. Are you kidding me? You're sitting here talking to the French while they're trying to bribe us and spend money and we're going to spend money that we don't have. We just got out of this constitutional crisis and this economic crisis. So it becomes this big deal. So with that said and done, Adams is facing opposition, right? So XYZ affair. Now, as he faces that kind of opposition, there becomes this little fight. It's called the Quasi War. Quasi is a prefix that means half or sort of or kind of, right? If you want to be colloquial about it, right? So it's kind of a war. And so the British and the Americans and the French fight this thing called the Quasi-War because of the diplomatic problem. Remember, XYZ affair. French said, pay us before we can talk diplomatically. Americans said no. And then there was a few little naval skirmishes called the Quasi-War. Now, deeper than that, when you're having a war in a country, usually there's going to be people who don't like it, right? Well, people who speak out against. The word sedition is for people who speak out against, right? So Adams thinks of this thing and says, look, I don't want people talking bad about my government in a time of war, so we're going to create this thing called the Sedition Act. So if you speak out against the government, if you write a newspaper article that's negative or whatever, guess what's going to happen? You are going to be put in a position where you end up going to jail or having to pay a fine. So that's the Sedition Act. Now there's going to be an Alien Act, where the Alien Act pretty much says if you do, if you're a different person, let me say, oh sorry, let me do this right. Sorry about that. Alien Act is real simple. Alien, being a foreigner, right? And so you thought that, it was brand new that we were mean to foreigners in our country, right? Anyway, so the Alien Act is a situation where there were people from other countries or born in other countries who live in the United States who were considered spies, who were considered individuals who may hurt the system, right? Therefore, they were just pretty much thrown out the country without any kind of trial or anything like that. So if you were an alien and suspected of doing things that would hurt the country, you were thrown out. So if you're an American who was talking bad about the government, sedition. If you were someone not from America who had something negative or bad to say about the country, you were thrown out. Pretty crazy, right? Well, Jefferson and his friends are going to be mad about that. And this is part of the reason why Adams doesn't get reelected, because the anti-federalists and the Jeffersonian Democrats are very upset about that, right? Last thing, let's talk about this thing called the Revolution of 1800. In the Revolution of 1800, you have a situation, or Jefferson calls it a revolution, because most times in the world, when a new type of government comes around or a new government comes around, people die, right? Let's be realistic. The Americans wanted independence. They wrote a letter, said, hey, give us independence. The British were like, no, and people died behind it. So it's crazy that you have the first president, Washington, Federalist. You have the second president, Adams, Federalist. And then the third president is going to be anti-Federalist. He's going to be a Democrat, Republican, a whole different regime. And no one died, right? It's a real revolution. There's going to be a political revolution in this country, and no one gets shot and murdered. It's a great thing. And we get very spoiled by that as a country nowadays. But think about it. In most places, not most places, but a lot of places in the world, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, there are still coups, like men who take guns and kill the president or destroy the leadership of a country through violence to this day, right? And so that's why it's the Revolution of 1800. And we're just going to go off with that. All right, thanks for the time. Chapter 8.